Well, howdy again everyone, and today I have another Fuji lens for their X system mirrorless cameras, the XF 18 to 135mm f3.5 to 5.6 R LM OIS WR. What a mouthful. It holds a somewhat unique position as being Fuji's only super zoom lens on that system, with a zoom range that's roughly the full frame equivalent of 27 to 203mm. On other camera systems, you can obviously get super zoom lenses that go far beyond 135mm, but Fuji probably kept the zoom range a little shorter on this one to reduce the compromises on image quality, as they tend to target the more discerning photographers on the market. And those photographers had better have deep pockets, as this lens costs $700 or about £600 in the UK, around twice as much as Canon's alternatives, for example. Still, some people will pay that for the convenience of a nice super zoom lens that they can take on holiday with them or just keep on a camera all the time. The disadvantage of super zoom lenses is that they have a darker maximum aperture, in this case f3.5 to 5.6, and so they're not so great for shooting in dark situations or getting out of focus backgrounds. And, as I mentioned, they tend to compromise quite a bit on image quality. This lens features image stabilization, which Fuji call OIS. Here's some footage with it turned off, and now turned on. As you can see, it holds your image nice and steady, and it works almost silently. Let's look at the lens's build quality. As one of Fuji's higher grade XF lenses, its fit and finish are nicer in many ways than your typical third-party super zoom lens. The barrel feels very solid, being made of metal and high quality plastics, and the rear lens mount is metallic, with a weather sealing gasket around the edge. In fact, Fuji emphasized that this lens is very well weather sealed in general. At the rear is the aperture ring. It's not marked with f-stop numbers because this is a variable aperture lens which gets darker as you zoom in. There is a switch where you can turn the aperture to auto mode though, if you want. Next comes a rubberized zoom ring. It actually turns a little stiffly, particularly when you reach the telephoto end of the zoom range. It's not much fun to use, if truth be told. Then a metallic focus ring that turns very smoothly. It's electronically coupled to the lens's focus motor. Here you can see that when you change focus manually, it definitely does not work very smoothly at all. You can also see that as you focus more closely on your subject, the lens zooms out just slightly, although really that focus breathing is not too bad. The lens's filter thread size is 67mm wide, and it comes with a smallish sized lens hood. Overall, I found that the build quality of the lens was good, but a little bit hit and miss as well. The weather sealing is reassuring and the lens feels solid, but that zoom ring is horrible, and it's definitely not an enjoyable lens to focus manually, although there's a small chance that's just because I was testing it on a slightly older camera body. Anyway, let's move on to image quality now. I'm testing it on a 24MP Fuji X-T20. At 18mm and f3.5, the middle of the image is very nice and sharp, with good contrast. The corners are definitely soft, with some purple fringing. They're sharper again at f5.6, not really any better at f8, but stop down to f11 and the corners do look a little sharper again. You won't want to stop down much further than that, because diffraction will begin to soften your image again. Let's zoom in a bit now to 50mm, where the maximum aperture is now f4.7. In the middle of the image, again, we see very good contrast and sharpness. This time though, the corner image quality is very good. Stop down just a little to f5.6 and it looks brilliant there. The corners remain this sharp down to about f11, so that's a much better performance in the middle of the zoom range. And finally, let's zoom all the way into 135mm, where the maximum aperture is now f5.6. Impressively, in the middle of your images, sharpness and contrast remain very high indeed. Sadly though, the less said about the image corners the better. Stop down to f8 for only a minuscule improvement, but at f11 those corners look a little clearer. So then, overall, it's good news and bad news. The lens's center image quality is always very impressive, with great sharpness and contrast. The bad news is that the image corners are pretty poor at wide angles or telephoto, although at least the middle of the zoom range looks good, and you can always top the aperture down for better results. Let's take a look at this lens's distortion and vignetting. These are normally corrected for you by your camera, but you can see what they're really like if you shoot in RAW mode. At 18mm we see some pretty ginormous barrel distortion here, and the corners are very dark at f3.5. Stopping down to f5.6 or f8 pushes that vignetting back into the edges, although it never really goes away without corrections. Zoom in to 31mm to see that distortion straighten out, and at 135mm it flips into mild pincushion distortion. Let's take a look at close-up image quality now. The lens can focus as closely as 45cm to your subject, pretty impressive really. At f5.6, contrast is a bit low when you shoot close-up. Stop down to f8 for a good improvement, and f11 for very sharp close-up image quality. Now let's see how well the lens works against bright lights. It's an impressive performance here, contrast remains high and flaring is minimal. Fuji's lens coatings seem to be really good. Now let's see about the quality of this lens's bokeh. A super zoom lens should hardly be your first port of call for getting a narrow depth of field in your images, but if you zoom in a little onto a smaller subject, then you can get a little bit of quite soft looking bokeh out of it. Overall, I'd say that the Fuji 18-135 is a slight cut above the average for a super zoom lens. It's nice to have the weather sealing and aperturing, and it's reasonably sharp, at least in the middle of your images. Its colours and contrast are quite good, which is always helpful. It does have its faults of course, and it's not really worth the huge amount of money you have to pay for it, but for a super zoom lens it performs well enough.